Amud Aleph, and it's eight two.
They split it 50, don't they? If they
It's
want
for-
$200, they split it.
Sorry, it's A1. What'd you say?
Do they split the ticket normally? That they say that Ruben owes Shimon $200.
Right.
The tax fees on the
Right. So in general, like you said, if they join together to obligate somebody money, and then they found to be zomimim, they found to be framers, they split it. They split it like you said. One guy would pay half, and the other guy would pay half. Exactly what you said. Now, the Gemara said maybe that's what they mean. Maybe that's what it means when it says that Eid Zomeim pays the Fichelko. Maybe it means that they pay according to their portion is such a thing. That if they two guys frame somebody, so the question is if they frame a guy for $1,000, so does each guy pay 500, or does each guy pay? Or each guy pay 1,000. That's so the halacha is you pay 500. You would not pay, like you said, Mr. Safdie. Each one would pay their share in what they wanted to obligate the other guy. And therefore, since that's already given, since it's already given, that's what they pay.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Morning. You don't need the rabbi, the later rabbi, to tell us something that we already know, right? That's something that we already know from a Mishnah. The Mishnah already told us that they split that. Okay, so therefore the Gemara says. So what is the meaning of Huda Marav? So we were up to the Gemara, and the Gemara said, Rava said that maybe it's talking about when he turns himself in. And he says, I said a false statement. He comes after he testifies, he goes ahead and he turns himself in. And he says, I testify falsely. And in that case, the chidush is, even though he's the only one, he turned himself in, the other guy did not turn himself in. The other guy did not say that he did something wrong. That comes the chidush in such a case that he has to pay. He'll pay his part if he turns himself in and he says he lied in his testimony. So he'll pay $500. Meaning to say, it's not the standard case when two people become found zomimim. When two people were found zomimim, that's where the Mishnah tells us that they pay. Each one pays their portion. But here they weren't found zomimim. They were found, he turned himself in. And here the chidush is, when you turn yourself in, also, in such a case, you'll pay your, even though the other guy was not found to be, he also will pay it. You have a question on that, Mr. Safdie? What do you mean it doesn't work? Oh, it's right. So the Gemara, but that din, when it comes to Eidos, if you want to change, so the Gemara says that, but there's a problem, because there's a rule called once you gave a testimony, you can't go ahead and, that's what you're saying, you can't go undo the Gemara comes back, you can't undo your testimony. So the Gemara says, Ella, the Gemara says, Ba'omer. Good morning, Jaime.
Morning.
Morning. So the last thing we said was, morning, Mr. Haber. We are on Gimel Amud Aleph. We are on the art scroll, Gimel Amud Aleph, 3A1. And the last thing that we said was, the Gemara Rava wanted to say, Be'eda Sheket Desi. We spoke about this on Friday, where he goes ahead and one of the witnesses turns himself in and he says, I testified falsely. And the Gemara says, if you turn yourself in and you say you testified falsely, there's a rule, once you gave a testimony, you can't change your testimony. So even though we spoke out that technically you can't change your testimony and your testimony remains, but by you yourself obligating yourself and say you testify falsely, you would have to pay. You would have to pay for causing somebody to lose money. Because even though we're not going to change the testimony of the person, and the testimony will remain, but you yourself have personal obligation because you caused. That's how many would learn. Others say no. Others say you would not have any obligation. Once we don't accept your testimony again, so therefore, so too, if you would say admit I testified falsely, you would not have to pay. At least the court down here will not punish you, because it's like grama. You cause a damage to somebody, and we know the courts don't generally will not obligate some of us for causing a damage, only when you directly damage somebody. Others say that this type of damage is a type of damage that you cause that you would collect. But the Gemara's point is, even if you're obligated to pay for your admission, you can't call him an Eid Zomem. Rav Yehuda Morav referred to this guy. He called him an Eid Zomem, a person who's a framer, pays according to his portion. If you don't, when we refer to someone as a framer throws out the verdict that was said before. The fact that we're not going to throw out the verdict that we said before, good morning, Dr. David, you can't call him a framer. You can't refer to him as an Eid Zomem. You could refer to him maybe as an Eid Sheker. You could refer to him as a false witness. And therefore, the Gemara says, this guy who comes forward and admits that I am the one, I testify falsely, that's not an Eid Zomem. Eid Zomem is when two other people come and say, you were with us. That's called an Eid Zomem. And then, if that happens, then we'll reverse the original verdict. Because therefore it comes out that you had no ability, you had no right to testify. Because you were with this guy's in a different part of the world at the time that the testimony was given. And the verdict was given based on your testimony. But if we're talking about a case when the guy was not found as an Eid Zomem, it's not that two other guys came and said you were with us. Rather, he himself turns himself in. That's not called an Eid Zomem. That's called an Eid Sheker. And therefore, if Rabbi Yehuda Morav says an Eid Zomem pays the Fi Chelko according to his portion, that can't be the case. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Aaron, good morning, Dr. Navid, good morning, Aaron. The Gemara says, you can't say that the case of Eid Zomem Mishalem Lefi Chelko. The Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav that an Eid Zomem plays according to his portion cannot be the case when he turns himself in and he says, I testify false. That's not called an Eid Zomem. We have to remember, there's something called an Eid Sheker, a false witness, and there's something called an Eid Zomem. Two different categories. The way it's used, and there's ramifications, like we said. What would be the ramification? The ramification would be, if I turn myself in, once I testified, my testimony remains, and I have responsibility, but it doesn't undo the verdict. Because we have a technical law is, once you gave testimony, you can't go back on your testimony. Unless, like we said, if you made a testimony and you could prove to the court that it was a clear mistake somehow. But if you change your testimony, you get one shot.
I don't understand the difference between Eid Zomem and Eid Sheker.
The difference is they're both in a certain sense false, but the difference would be the following: an Eid Zomem means that two people come and say about a witness, you guys were with us on that and that date that you went ahead, you went to court, you made a testimony based on a certain date. You said you saw something on a certain date. Comes two witnesses come and say about about the first pair of witnesses, or one of the two, or both of them, you were with us in a different town, a different place, on the date that you say you saw the crime, or you saw the loan, or whatever you said, you were somewhere else in the world. Okay? Now, if the Torah says we accept the second pair of witnesses. Once we accept the second pair of witnesses, so whatever the first pair of witnesses had said in the past to the court says we made a mistake. We accepted witnesses that had no right to testify because they were in some other part of the country at the time that they came, that they claimed they saw something in New York, but they were in China at that time. They're going to have to undo their verdict. Whatever their verdict was, they're going to undo it. Plus, they're going to impose a penalty on the witnesses to do to them what they wanted to do to the other guy. Okay? So let's say they obligated Ruvain to pay Shimon $1,000. So now they're going to undo the verdict. And Shimon, even if Ruvain paid Shimon the money, Shimon is going to give Ruvain back the $1,000. Plus, those witnesses that framed him have to give Ruvain $1,000. So Ruvain will get back his original $1,000 that he paid Shimon, based on the testimony of the first pair of witnesses. Plus, he's going to receive $1,000 from the witnesses that framed him. Okay, or if they did not yet, execute the verdict, they just said Reuven has to pay Shimon $1,000. He didn't pay it yet. The witnesses that were found to be framers have to pay the $1,000 to Reuven. They want to cause a loss of $1,000 to Reuven. They have to pay what they wanted to cost to Reuven. That's if the second pair of witnesses come in and say, you guys, the first pair of witnesses, you with us on that day that you claim you saw that, you with us. That's Zomimim. Eidu Sheker is when the case that the Gemara is now suggesting is that the first pair of witnesses came to court. Morning, Morris. They came to court. The court checked them out, and the court verified their testimony, and the court gave a ruling. They gave a ruling. Then no other pair of witnesses come forward. He himself comes to court and he says, you know what? I lied. Whatever I said that I saw such and such a thing, I did not, I made it up. That's what the case happened. Question: does the court undo their verdict? But the court already had made a verdict previously. Would the court undo the verdict? And even if the court did not undo their verdict, even if they didn't make a verdict yet, once the court accepted his testimony, he can't go back on his testimony. His testimony remains. The court keeps his testimony. They don't strike that testimony from the court. The only thing that will happen to him is that maybe he's going to have to pay for creating a false testimony and causing a loss to somebody. But the testimony remains. They don't undo the verdict that they created, because they have a rule. There's a rule is a witness has one shot. He could come once. He can't undo what he says. He could say he could say what he wants to say, but he cannot come and contradict what he said before. He can't come on Sunday and say one thing to the court, then on Monday to change his mind. We're not going to accept that. You said from Sunday. That's what you said. You said we're going to go with what you said, the first thing what you said. But you come on Monday and you say you lied. That means you're admitting that you owe money, because you're admitting you caused this loss. So we'll give you a fine for that. But we're not undoing the verdict. So that's the difference, Jaime, between Eid Zomim and Eid Sheker. Eid Zomim, we're undoing the verdict, because the court acknowledges that those witnesses that came to court, we threw out their testimony because they were found to be Zomimim. But we don't throw out the testimony of witnesses when they were not found by other witnesses, only as a result of his own admission.
Let me just clarify.
What do you say?
Let me just clarify. An Eid Zomem is proven to be false by someone else, and Eid Sheker is by his own admission.
Right. At least that's how the Gemara is
okay, but is that the definition in the way that we're learning it right now?
Yes. Our definition, I'll go right. Eid Sheker is from when he is turning himself in. It could be the law might be different if two other people will make him into a false witness. Maybe that might be different because then he's disqualified not through his own testimony, through the testimony of someone else. Because we have a technical rule. Once you give testimony, you can't undo that testimony. Someone else maybe could undo your testimony. But you yourself can't go ahead and go back and retract what you said to the court. So halacha states, it also, I think it's a very short time period, by the way. But I recall it might be like a few, it's not like you made your statement, you have a very short time period, maybe within a second or two, I think it says, we have to look, it's a very short time when you could change, because maybe once you made a clear statement, if you could prove to the court that it was a mistake, a common type of mistake, then it's different. But if it's not that it's a common mistake, it's not a clear mistake. That's what I saw in the Aruch HaShulchan, that if it's clear that it's a mistake, that's clear to the court, there's no question, it's a common mistake, it's an understandable mistake. But when it's not that, I say you borrowed $1,000, and then you say, no, it was $500. That's not a type of thing that you make a mistake. That's what I would understand. There's certain things that we have to identify what is the common type of mistake. 1,000 is 1,000. 500 is 500. It's not a type of thing that's a common mistake. That's not the normal. You see what I'm saying, Mr. Saber? Yes.
From the Zamini, from the guy with the chicken, from whatever, but who's going to be king?
Right. The Gemara, our Gemara Akiva, our Gemara is trying to understand one thing. On this what does Rabbi Yehuda Amarav mean? Rabbi Yehuda Amarav says, Eid Zomeim Mishalem Lefi Chelko. So now we need to identify what is the case. There's a law, as the Hebrew always says, law, case, reason. We have a law. Now we have to understand, Rabbi London, my father used to also do the law, case, reason, by the way. What is law? We have a law. Eid Zomeim pays according to his portion. What is the case talking about? The Gemara is in search of the case because the Gemara already suggested a couple of things. The Gemara knocked them off. The Gemara says, because the Gemara's first suggestion was you pay according to your portion. That means if you were found Zomamim, if the witnesses were found Zomamim, if they try to obligate $1,000, each guy should pay $500. You pay according to your portion. So, and there were 3 witnesses, each one pays $333 and change. The Gemara says that can't be, because we already learned that already. That's not Rabbi Yehuda Marav coming to tell us. So what does Rabbi Yehuda Marav coming to tell us? That's what the Gemara is in search. Dr. Navid, you're with us in the Gemara over here? Beautiful. So now the Gemara is going to say another possibility to explain this. Ella, the first word of the line in the Hebrew Gemara is Hebrew side is Ella ba'omer. And in the Art Scroll 3A1, it's on the right side. Ella ba'omer, next to the last paragraph of the page, about 10 lines in English. Ella ba'omer. They come forward and they say, Ha'adanu. We testified. See the language, Ha'adanu, the language of aid. Dr. Navid, you see the word aid inside those words, the shoresh? Ha'adanu, v'huzamnu. Huzamnu has the word zomim. We testified and we became zomimim. We have 2 other witnesses came and said about us, bebezim ploni. One second. Bebezim ploni. He comes forward and he says, we testified and we became zomimim in another court. So what happens? One of these witnesses come forward and he says, and he comes to a different court, and he says in a different court, I want you to know that we became Zomamim in court number 1. I became a Zomim in court number 1. Here he walks into court number 2. Let's say one person. One person walks into court number 2 and he says, you know what happened in court number 1, that they don't have the emails and text messages and telephone. They didn't know about what happened in court number 1. And he tells them, you know what happened? I became a zomeim in court number 1. They found me as a framer in court number 1.
Why not?
What'd you say?
Why not? They want both of them because the client, like, I don't know, but he's making this one. But they say, they knew.
Right. One of them, right. One of the witnesses come forward and says, I and my friend testified in another court, and we were found framers. That's what he says. One of the witnesses comes forward. He walks into court number 2. He talks on behalf of others, which in truth, he will not be believed regarding somebody else. One guy cannot obligate somebody else money. But he's talking, as Mr. Haber says, on behalf of both of them. And he says, we became zomamim. We were found in court number 1 to be framers. So now the question is, will court number 2 go ahead and obligate him money based on his statement, on his admission that he came to court number 2 and he admitted, I owe money. He admitted I was found as zomeim in court number 1. Now the question is, he's the court number, at this point of the Gemara, he did not say, and the court number 1 assessed a obligation of money. The court only said, I am a framer. Then they did not yet assess how much I have to pay for my framing. Usually you pay exactly what you wanted to cause the other guy. They did not give money, Daniel. They did not yet give that verdict exactly. They did not assess the financial penalty yet. They only said, if I'm found, they said we are zomamim.
Is Plony a real place, or that's a made-up name?
Plony is like a made-up name. It's like you say, Plony. It's in a certain place. It's undisclosed place. Correct.
Got it.
So the fact that he goes ahead and he says, so in a certain sense, he's telling the court, he's admitting to something in court number 2 to what happened in court number 1. And now comes the Gemara and says, court number 2 could go ahead and assess a payment that this guy has to pay based on his admission to court number 2. He comes to the second court, and Eid Zomeim has to pay for his admission. Now that you admitted that you were found as a framer in court number 1, so now court number 2 has the right to go ahead and impose a penalty, a fine, an amount of money on you to pay because of what you said happened in court number 1. And even though the other guy did not come to court and say that he was found as zomeim, the second witness did not turn himself, say to the second court. Only one witness said, we're going to accept that testimony of the second witness about himself, and he's going to have to pay. That's what the Gemara, and that will be the chidush. So the Gemara says, but we know the law follows Rabbi Akiva. And we had it the Gemara earlier that if you admit to a fine, if you run into another court, after you found as a framer at the first court, Rabbi Akiva says the second court cannot impose a penalty on you, because since the first court did not create the penalty, we said when you admit in a penalty, you do not pay when you turn yourself into a penalty. If a person turns himself in, we gave the case. A person went ahead and says that he admits that he stole $100. So in general, if you steal and you're caught, you have to pay double. But if you turn yourself in, you don't have to pay the fine, the extra fine, double. You only pay the principal. So here, when the whole thing, Edom Zomim, Rabbi Akiva says Edom Zomim is a knas. Rabbi Akiva says it's a penalty. It's not compensation, because you pay for something that you didn't even actually do. You just attempted to obligate somebody money. And Rabbi Akiva holds, if I go ahead, if witnesses turn them, if somebody is a zomeim, Rabbi Akiva holds Eid Zomamim, if you turn yourself in as Zomamim, the Zomamim will not have to go ahead and pay the penalty, right? If the Zomamim say that we were Zomamim, if they go to another court and they say that we were found Zomamim in court number 1, right? Rabbi Akiva says that Eid Zomamim will not, the second court will not have the ability to go ahead and impose a fine on the witnesses, because the witnesses are admitting to a penalty. Yes.
Lessening the punishment for someone who like is guilty, because it's intended for them to tell the truth. But to remove punishment altogether, people can retaliate. They can use that as a loophole, go around, try to frame something, and then later say, you know what, I admit I made a mistake. We get all stopped.
Yeah, we're talking about, okay, so we're saying like this. If the court did not obligate, we're talking about a case. But we're talking, if the same court, again, the same court that he was found guilty, that court, many will say, could go ahead, they could go ahead and obligate him. They found, even though they didn't, he turns himself into that same court, the court just found him guilty, he's not going to get off the hook. But here the question is, right. The only thing is, regarding he could be off, and the second court can't obligate him. The first court could still obligate him the money. We're saying like this. We're saying before a witness is found, let's say the court did not found him to be a Zomamim. He comes to court, the court is doing its proceedings, no verdict was done. He wants to turn himself in, nothing, he turns himself in, he admits to a penalty, and he should be off the hook. The court did not make a verdict yet based on his testimony. The court makes a verdict based on his testimony, right? So now we said and then if the court made a verdict on his testimony and he turns himself in, right? And nothing happened yet. The court did not obligate any money yet based on the testimony. They gave a verdict, no money was given. So he admits to a fine, he should be off the hook. But if the court found him to be Zomamim, he didn't turn himself in. The court found him to be a framer. Once that court finds him to be a framer, even though they did not assess a value yet, they have the right, of course, they're going to assess, they're going to get him. He's going to have to pay for framing the guy. But if the court number 1 didn't say how much money he has to pay for framing somebody, they did not assess a penalty value yet. And he goes ahead and he runs to court number 2 before the first court said how much he has to pay for his fine. The second court, Rabbi Akiva says, will not impose the fine on him. Only the first court could go ahead and impose the fine on him, because he was not found guilty, because the court didn't, since there was no official amount of money obligated to him yet. So in a certain sense, the second court can't, and the second court only knows based on his own admission, they won't obligate him money. Only the first court will go ahead and obligate him.
Why would he even go to the second? To try to get a lesser fine?
Why would he go to the second court?
If he was found already as his own.
So I'm in the first court.
What is the advantage of going? Why do you want to go to the second?
Maybe he wanted to get over with it. Maybe he moved to another town, and now he comes to the second court. He tells the court what happened in the first court. Sometimes the guy might want to run to the second court to free himself of the whole thing if he thinks he can get away with it.
Probably a waiting on the person.
Right. So to go, or he wants sometimes if he feels he can get off, if he doesn't realize when he could get off, when he can't get off. They will not impose the fine on him if he admits in the second court. So the Gemara says,
The first court has not mentioned he's a Zolam.
if the first court did not say he's a Zomem,
And he goes to the second.
and he
court,
turns himself in,
and says, "You know what?
so then he should be off the hook, according to Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because the court no money was given, was was given to anyone based on his testimony. So, and he turns himself into a fine. What? The court case wasn't finished. So he admitted we have no verdict. So he should be off. He's admitting it's like turning yourself in on a possible penalty that was not known yet. So you should be able to be off the hook. But he's admitting that he was a domain. So he was not made a domain yet. Court never made him. He's right. So therefore he should be off the hook because he never caused any loss to anybody. There was never a verdict from the court that should get him off.
But he can't do that in the first.
He could do that in the first court before they made a verdict that he's a framer. Once he made a verdict, he's a framer. He's a framer. Right, exactly. So the Gemara says like this. So the Gemara says, Ella ba'omer hadana v'zam bezes pony. We became, he says about him and his friend, that we became zomim in the first court. And based on that, he has to pay his portion. That's why he has to pay his portion. Command the local Rabbi Akiva. That's not like Rabbi Akiva. And the Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva says you will not pay in the second court based on your own admission. So the Gemara says Ella, and the law follows Rabbi Akiva. So we don't want to say that Rabbi Yehuda Marav is arguing Rabbi Akiva. So what is the case? Back to the drawing board. What is the case of Rabbi Yehuda Marav that an Eid Zomeim pays according to his portion? So the Gemara says, you know what the case is? Here we found the final, we got the case. Ela ba'omer hadanu, he says, we testified, v'uzamnu b'bezes ploni. We became false witnesses or zomimim framers in the first court. And v'chiyuvanu mamon. And the first court obligated us money. So now, once the first court obligates them their money, there's no way, then every court in the world has the ability to obligate their money. If they turn themselves in anywhere in the world, they're turning themselves into a pre-existing obligation. Because there was already obligation of money. If I owe somebody money and I come to any court in the world and I say I owe the guy $1,000, I got to pay the $1,000. Because that's the principle, what I owe. That's what I owe. It's not not a penalty, it's I owe. So once the court assesses an amount of money that he owes, the Torah says you have to pay what the judges assess. So once the judge assesses that amount, you have to pay it. So what's the chidush? The chidush is that you're going to second court and you're saying and now you're not believed regarding your second friend. And we have a rule, we said that if one aid is found to be a zomein, if one witness is found to be a framer, right? We have two witnesses here. One witness was found to be a framer, and the second witness was not found to be a framer. What's the rule? We said the witness does not pay. The witness that was found to be a framer, good morning, Jay. The only time the witness that was found to be a framer pays if they were both found to be framers. But if one of them was found to be a framer, he does not need to pay. Correct? So now, when he turns himself in to the court only knows about them both being framers based on his testimony. And the court is not going to listen to what he said about his friend. He doesn't have the power to turn in his friend. But he does admit, he says both of us were framers in the first court. He says in the second court that we both were framers, and he says in the first that we were both found to be framers. And therefore, that comes the chidush of Rabbi Yehuda Marav, that even though the second court only accepts his testimony, his admission regarding himself, nevertheless, we are going to obligate him for his portion, even though it's not established by the second court that they both were framers. They only know that both were framers based on his own admission. Good morning. And that's the Chiddush. Salkadai Techamina. I might have thought the Gemara says, even the since he cannot obligate his friend, because one person is not believed to say about my friend, I can't say that my friend was found to be a framer in court number one. Me and Mr. Haber could go in and say about somebody that they were found to be framers. One person cannot say that. So you might think that he should also not be obligated because of the general rule that it aids domain. The only time the zomim, the framers pay, because when they're both found to be framers. Kamash Malon, the chiddush is that since he is saying that they both were framers in court number one, in court number two, he says we were found both to be framers, and therefore, based on his admission, it makes sense that they should be obligated money because when two people are found as framers, they have to pay. So therefore, we have the chidush that he'll pay for his portion of this, back to the old law, that when two people are found to be framers, each person pays for their portion. If there was 4 people that framed somebody, each person will pay 25% of the amount. And so depending how many witnesses were on the deal. And that's what the Gemara, and that's the Gemara's conclusion over here. He comes to court two, and he pays whatever, depending on how many witnesses there were. If he says there was 3 witnesses that were framers, then he'll pay a third. In court number 2, he admitted in court number 2 that the court number 1 obligated. He says we were framers in court number 1, and they assessed an obligation of money. Court number 1, they said he could pay. He should. I mean, court number 1 could also collect from him. So we said maybe he moved to another town. He didn't pay it up in town number 1. He wants to officially, let's say, pay for it and wants the court to recognize that it's been paid for, it's been taken care of, and nobody could come over to collect money from him again a second time. He wants to get over with it. Or he might have thought by admitting in court number 2, maybe somehow, so maybe things will be better for him. That, maybe the second court has less jurisdiction of doing anything. There's no way he will have to pay in the second. So the chiddush is that even though we have a general rule that you only could zomim only pay if they were both found to be zomim. Court number 2 does not really know that the other guy was found to be a zomim. It's only based on his testimony. The court number 2, he says, I and the other guys are found to be zomim. Reuven says about me, Shimon and Levi were found to be zomim. We got court number got convicted, but the court number 2 does not believe them regarding Shimon and Levi. Court number 2 because you cannot turn in, one guy can't turn in 2 people, anybody. I can't say that Shimon is obligated money. I can't say I'm one person. I cannot do that. And since the court number 2 will not believe me regarding what I say regarding Shimon and Levi, so you might have thought that even regarding myself, I wouldn't have to pay. Right. Dr. Navid, you want to say something?
What happens if he doesn't pay?
The court has the right to go after him. To what they need to do to take collateral or whatever they have. That's the job of the court to shoftim v'shotrim. Shoftim is the judges, and shotrim is the officers to enforce the law. We have both judges and we have officers to enforce the law to make sure that the law is kept. Okay, Mabruk Mazel Tov, we got to the Mishnah. Tomorrow we're going to start a new Mishnah. We're going to get into Ketubah tomorrow. Interesting stuff about witnesses and Ketubah. Have a great day, everybody. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good
Thank you
day.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you for joining. See you later. Be in touch later. Yes. Have a great day, everybody. Beautiful davening.